Late 1941. Fremantle Harbour, Western Australia. Aboard a transport ship arriving from North Africa, the sea voyage had been long, humiliating, and defined by the grim, cramped reality of captivity. Thousands of German and Italian soldiers, members of the Africa Corps, veterans of the Desert War, and sailors from sunken U-boats and raiders were being transferred to a place most of them could not locate on a map: Australia. They were accustomed to the confined theaters of war, the dusty, rocky battlefields of the Mediterranean, the familiar landscape of Europe, or the cold, dark confines of a submarine. They expected a prisoner of war camp to be a grim but familiar environment: high walls, watchtowers, armed guards, and a nearby town. What awaited them was a landscape that defied every geographical and psychological expectation. As the ships docked in Australian ports, the prisoners' journey continued inland, deep into the heart of the continent. The initial shock came from the sheer scale of the journey. Train journeys across Europe rarely lasted more than a day or two. The trip into the interior of Australia stretched for days. The landscape outside the cramped train cars changing from coastal towns to a vast, unsettling emptiness. Mile after mile, hour after hour, the view remained the same: flat, reddish-brown earth, sparse, unfamiliar trees, and a horizon that stretched into infinity, meeting an immense, scorching blue sky. The air, dry and hot, was utterly different from the humidity of the coast or the familiarity of home. The journey was a masterclass in unintentional psychological warfare. The prisoners, men who understood distance and boundaries, found themselves confronted by a land that seemed to have no end. This was the Outback, a term many of them would soon learn, and it was a territory that dwarfed anything they had ever conceived. The German command had always taught that strength lay in seizing and holding ground. Here, the ground itself was an infinite, overwhelming presence. Finally, they arrived at their destinations: remote camps such as Hay in New South Wales or Murchison in Victoria. These were not the grim, stone fortresses of European prisons. They were sprawling, temporary enclosures, often built hastily, consisting primarily of low corrugated iron huts and simple perimeter fences. The fences, typically nothing more than a few strands of barbed wire, looked woefully inadequate. Many prisoners, especially the eager young men of the Africa Corps, immediately began planning their escape, assessing the guards, the distance to the fence, and the time needed to cut their way out. The fences, however, were not the real jail. The prisoners soon understood the true, genius deterrent of the Australian design. The guards, often older men or those unfit for active combat duty, overseas, were few. The fences were rudimentary. The real prison was the landscape itself. Looking out from the confines of their camp, they saw not the safety of a nearby town or a border they could cross, but the relentless, silent expanse of the Australian desert. The vast emptiness was a barrier of 1,000 miles, a psychological barrier that no fence could replicate. The isolation was crushing. To escape meant not just cutting through wire, but surviving an environment that was utterly hostile and completely unfamiliar. There were no paths, no major roads leading to freedom, and certainly no friendly civilian population waiting to help a German or Italian soldier. The scale of the continent itself was the ultimate jailer, forcing the prisoners to face the horrifying question: where would we go? Escape was no longer a matter of speed and stealth. It was a matter of geographical impossibility. The initial confidence of the captured soldiers was slowly, surely draining away, replaced by the crushing realization that they were trapped, not by walls of stone, but by the endless red dust of the Australian continent. Summer 1942, Camp Hay, New South Wales, Australian Outback. The German prisoners of war were not naive men. Many were veterans of the Afrika Korps, accustomed to heat, discomfort, and the stark discipline of war. But the Australian summer was a force of nature they were utterly unprepared for. The heat in the iron huts of Camp Hay was suffocating, turning the simple corrugated iron walls into giant ovens. Temperatures routinely soared well above 40 degrees Celsius, turning the air into a dry, abrasive blast that withered the unaccustomed European skin. The prisoners soon realized that the climate itself was a relentless, active form of imprisonment. Dehydration was a constant threat, and the relentless sun made any outdoor movement during the day a torturous ordeal. The initial weeks saw a predictable wave of escape attempts. The German and Italian prisoners, men of action and military honor, felt compelled by their duty to break out. They saw the few strands of barbed wire, the intermittent patrols by the older, less rigorous Australian guards, and the seemingly endless, flat expanse, and they thought, "We can walk our way out." They were disastrously wrong. The first escapees, fit young men with impressive military records, were found within days, not by patrols, but by local farmers or Aboriginal trackers, often collapsed and delirious from thirst and heat stroke. Their uniforms were shredded by the thorny scrub, their bodies covered in blisters and sun damage. The biggest shock came not from the heat, but from the alien ecosystem of the outback. These soldiers were trained to identify hostile military forces, but they had no defense against the environment itself. The flat, seemingly empty landscape was, in fact, teeming with dangerous life. The prisoners quickly learned the local vernacular for creatures they had never imagined: funnel-web spiders lurking in dark corners, and snakes, the massive eastern brown snakes, and inland taipans, whose venom was quick and lethal. These silent, natural sentries were more effective than any armed guard. One successful escape required not just cutting wire, but navigating a natural minefield of deadly fauna whose warning signs were subtle and unknown to the Europeans. The few prisoners who managed to evade immediate capture were soon brought back by a lack of basic human necessities. The outback contained no secret caches of supplies, no friendly villages willing to harbor Axis soldiers, and no clearly marked paths to civilization. Even worse, the landscape offered no viable resources. The occasional waterhole was often brackish, foul, or guarded by aggressive wildlife. The land that looked like vast emptiness was, in fact, a cruel, self-sustaining prison designed to kill those who did not understand its rules. The distances were deceptive. A 10-mile walk under a scorching sun felt like 50, and a 2-day journey without water was a death sentence. The prison guards quickly understood the effectiveness of their jail. They often employed a strategy that emphasized retrieval over active deterrence. They knew the desert would do their job for them. The guards rarely pursued escapees with great urgency, preferring instead to simply monitor the periphery and wait for the inevitable distress signal or the collapse of the fleeing men. This approach was brutally efficient and psychologically crushing to the prisoners. The German command inside the camp realized that their most formidable enemy was not the Australian army, but the silent, geological reality of the continent. The failure of the initial, brave escape attempts had a deep, psychological impact on the thousands of men held in the camps. The realization took hold that even the most meticulously planned escape was doomed to fail against the sheer indifference of the Australian environment. The few strands of barbed wire were merely a formality, a suggestion of imprisonment. The true jail was the thousands of miles of uninhabited desert that surrounded them. The prisoners, men who had faced machine guns and artillery without flinching, were reduced to helplessness by sun, thirst, and the threat of an unseen venomous spider, the Outback had become the perfect, unassailable barbed wire prison. Mid-1943, Camp Murchison, Victoria, Australian Outback, and Camp Hay, New South Wales. The failures of the initial escape attempts across the Australian prisoner of war days. Camps marked a profound psychological turning point for the Axis prisoners. The German and Italian soldiers, disciplined and driven by the military code of honor that demanded a constant pursuit of freedom, had finally conceded defeat, not to the Australian army, but to the Australian continent. With the endless, lethal vastness of the Outback confirmed as an unassailable barrier, the thousands of men faced a crucial choice: descend into the despair of isolation, or channel their formidable military organization and technical skills into the construction of a viable, internal society. They chose the latter, and the remote, dusty camps like Murchison and Hay soon became home to one of the most organized and highly cultural prison communities of the war. The transformation was astonishing. The prisoners, realizing they would be confined for the duration of the conflict, began to create a miniature version of their home countries within the barbed wire fences. The highly trained officers and sailors, men who had commanded U-boats or fought in tank battles, applied their organizational skills to building and managing infrastructure. They established complex internal hierarchies, complete with their own court systems, disciplinary measures, and systems for internal communication that operated with a chilling efficiency that often surprised their Australian captors. This internal organization was not simply to pass the time. It was a military strategy for psychological survival, a way to maintain their military identity and honor even in defeat. The focus shifted from military action to intellectual and artistic pursuits. The camps became centers of high culture. The prisoners, particularly the Germans, established elaborate theaters, building stages, sets, and elaborate costumes from salvaged materials and donated items. They performed complex operas and classical plays from the German repertoire, providing entertainment and a powerful sense of connection to the culture they had left behind. They created universities within the camp, with educated officers and non-commissioned officers teaching subjects ranging from engineering and mathematics to philosophy and foreign languages. These educational pursuits were taken seriously, with lectures, exams, and formal certificates of attendance. The creative outlet became a necessary antidote to the isolation and the relentless, monotonous heat. The Italian prisoners, renowned for their craftsmanship, transformed scrap metal and wood into intricate sculptures, jewelry, and furniture. The Germans, utilizing the available materials, developed ingenious ways to pass the time, including building detailed model ships and intricate wood carvings. This flurry of intellectual and creative activity served a dual purpose. It maintained morale and, more importantly, it was a subtle act of defiance. They demonstrated to their captors and to themselves that the Australian Outback could cage their bodies, but it could not crush their minds or their cultural identity. The relationship with the local Australian community was often surprisingly complex. The prisoners, due to the critical shortage of manpower in Australia, were frequently employed in farm labor outside the confines of the camp. They were trusted, largely because the psychological barrier of the Outback was considered foolproof. These labor opportunities provided the prisoners with better food, fresh air, and a temporary respite from the suffocating enclosure. They worked alongside Australian farmers, often forming grudging, temporary relationships built on mutual respect for hard work, a unique and often unacknowledged aspect of the war in the Pacific theatre. The Australian government understood that the vast, intimidating land was their greatest asset. Their guards were often instructed to treat the prisoners humanely, knowing that the real punishment was the unending horizon and the knowledge of their geographical impossibility. The German and Italian prisoners, men who had feared the bullets and bombs of the Allied forces, now faced the silent, psychological terror of the sheer, desolate scale of the Australian outback. Their sophisticated, self-sustaining camp culture was a testament to their resilience, but it was also a quiet acknowledgement that the barbed wire was merely a suggestion. The vast, red emptiness was the immutable jailer. Post-war era, 1946 and beyond, the Australian outback and European cities. The guns fell silent in 1945, but the story of the thousands of German and Italian prisoners of war in the Australian outback was far from over. Unlike many theatres of war where prisoners were swiftly repatriated, the logistics of transporting thousands of Axis personnel the vast distance back to Europe took time. Many prisoners, particularly the Italians, remained in Australian camps until 1947, working on farms and in rural industries, continuing the labour they had begun during their captivity. This prolonged presence created an unexpected legacy, a strange, often positive, connection between the prisoners and the land that had once been their jailer. For a significant number of these former enemies, the isolation and sheer scale of the Australian continent, which had initially been a source of profound psychological dread, transformed into a powerful, silent attraction. They had survived the extreme heat, the alien wildlife, and the crushing loneliness. They had learned the rules of the outback, and in doing so, had developed a grudging respect for its unforgiving beauty. For these men, returning to the bombed-out cities and economic wreckage of post-war Europe held little appeal. They petitioned the Australian government to allow them to stay, recognizing the vast opportunities presented by the empty continent. The Australian government, facing a severe labour shortage, allowed many former Italian and some German prisoners to apply for immigration. These men, once soldiers of the Axis powers, became a quiet but powerful wave of post-war immigrants, bringing their organizational skills, craftsmanship, and a deep understanding of rural life to the continent. They settled primarily in the regions surrounding their former prison camps, becoming successful farmers, builders, and businessmen. The legacy of the remote camps was not just barbed wire and despair, it was also the foundation for the successful integration of a unique group of post-war migrants. Today, the sites of the former prisoner of war camps, places like Hay and Murchison, are marked by quiet historical markers, or sometimes by the remnants of the buildings and infrastructure the resourceful prisoners created. The meticulous theatres, the elaborate artwork, and the educational systems that flourished within the barbed wire are celebrated as a testament to human resilience and the refusal of the spirit to surrender, even when the body was caged. The history of these camps is taught as a unique chapter in Australia's war history, often overlooked but profoundly important. The ultimate takeaway from this bizarre chapter of World War II history is the realization that geography can be the most effective prison. The physical fence lines were nothing more than a suggestion. A determined man could cut the wire in minutes, but the true, insurmountable jail was the sheer, silent scale of the Australian outback, 1,000 miles of heat, thirst, and unknown danger. The harsh environment required resources, knowledge, and endurance that the European soldiers simply did not possess. The psychological barrier of the endless, unmapped desert proved to be a far more potent deterrent than any military force. The German and Italian prisoners who survived their captivity in the outback were men who learned one profound truth. They were defeated not by the soldiers guarding them, but by the overwhelming, unforgiving majesty of the Australian continent itself. The land was their ultimate jailer, and its emptiness was the final, unassailable wall. The story of the Axis prisoners in the Australian Outback is a powerful look at how geography and psychology shaped the outcome of the war. They survived the bullets, but the desert broke their will to escape. If you were surprised that the Australian landscape was a more effective prison than barbed wire, please hit the like button and share this video with a friend who loves history. And tell us this: if you had to choose to be imprisoned in the freezing isolation of Siberia or the scorching emptiness of the Australian Outback, which psychological challenge would you choose to face? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the hidden stories and geographical ironies of world history.